Hello dear learner, I welcome you to the lecture 1 of week 5, and the topic of today's lecture is post-Marxist critique of determinism and the dialectical method. First of all, we will have an overview of the concepts which will be covered in today's lecture. First of all, we will be understanding what we mean by post-Marxist approach, then what we mean by the concept of determinism and the concept of dialectics. Then we will understand how these concepts have been used in the Marxist theory. Then after that we will understand the post-Marxist critique of determination and the concept of dialectics. So with this I begin with the understanding of the theory of post-Marxism. Now post-Marxism is a reinterpretation of Marxism from the late 1970s onwards, centering on some of the fundamental tenets of classical Marxism like the materialism, economism, historical determinism, anti-humanism and the class reductionism. Now it has been influenced by post-structuralism and postmodernism, who have rejected all the grand narratives, including the classical Marxism itself. It has been associated with theorists such as Lyotard, Baudrillard, Foucault, Argentine political theorist Ernesto Laclau, and the Belgian political theorist Chantal Mouffe, and also Stuart Hall. It is based on an anti-essentialist approach in which class, society, and history are no longer treated as unitary, universal, also pre-discursive categories. So we have seen in our earlier lecture the important tenets of Marxism. Here we have seen how Karl Marx have interpreted history in economic terms, or he has given the economic interpretation of history. Then we have seen how he has used the Hegelian method of dialectics to understand the process of historical development. And with this method, he has also attempted to understand how conflicts arises between different classes in the society and how that leads to changes in the economic production of one particular stage of history, and it leads to the establishment of another type of production. So therefore, he has used concepts of dialectics, the concept of determinism, he has used the notion of the working class, he has used the notion of revolution, and he has tried to develop a theory of change and transformation. Now, those who were aiming at reinterpreting the Marxist writing or the post-Marxist thinkers, they wanted to ensure that certain reinterpretations of the essential writings or essential concepts of the Marxist approach are made, so that the theory it stays relevant in the present times also. In the present conditions of politics, the important tenets of Marxism still stays relevant. So for that purpose, they have made certain reinterpretations, and they have done that through questioning the key concepts or the key ideas of Marxism. And of course, it has been influenced by some other currents of thought like the post-structuralism and postmodernism. And we must remember that all these theories, they have questioned the existence of grand narratives and their relevance in the present world. They believe that Marxism is also a grand narrative, which is aiming at providing a total solution to the human problems in the society, whereas they argue that we do not need grand narratives, but we need the micro narratives. And it has been associated with some of the very influential theorists of the time, and we have already mentioned their names. Now, we must understand that it is based on an anti-essentialist approach. It does not believe in essentialism. Essentialism is basically, it is an understanding of the fact that everything is constituted by certain essence or certain fixed characteristics, and that can help us in defining the nature and characteristic of that particular thing. Like all the human beings have a human essence, and with the help of that essence we can understand human beings across the world. Now, we find that such type of essentialism is in existence, or it has been used in other categories also, and therefore the post-Marxist approach or thinkers, they have criticized that in the present changing world we cannot define everything in terms of an essentialist approach or in terms of a foundationalist approach. We need much more contingent approach, we need a much more micro approach. Now, Marxist theory has also been influenced by a very notable thinker, that is Gramsci's concept of hegemony, where he has argued that the role of ideology and culture is very important in terms of influencing changes and transformation in the society in comparison to the economic factors. We have already studied Gramsci, and we have seen that how the role of ideology and culture, which has been neglected in the classical Marxist theory, has been underlined and given importance to by Gramsci. So, therefore, when we are talking about the economic determinism, you can see that it has been reinterpreted by the post-Marxist thinkers like Gramsci, when he said that it is not only the economic factors which determines the nature of society or the nature of class relations or the nature of state, but it is the ideology and culture which is independent of the economic structure and which in its own way influences the functioning of the state. So, from this perspective, we understand first of all what we mean by the term that is determinism. Now, it is a doctrine that all events, including human action, are ultimately determined by causes regarded as external to the will. Some philosophers have taken the notion of determinism to imply that individual human beings have no free will. They cannot be held morally responsible for their actions. They do not possess the agency to bring about change. So, it is a particular way of understanding how human beings act in the society, whether their thoughts and actions are determined by some external agency, or they have their own individual capacity or the agency to take decisions and to act in an autonomous manner. And therefore, the principle of determinism says that all events, including human actions, according to this principle, is determined by some factors which is external to that event or external to human beings, and also it is external to the will. So, here the individual is considered as a dependent variable, having no independent existence, having no autonomy of will, having no capacity to take one's own independent decisions, or they lack the agency. And therefore, some of the philosophers have taken the principle of determinism to imply that individual human beings have no free will, and therefore, since all their actions are determined by some external agency or external agents, so therefore, they cannot be condemned for their action, or they cannot be held responsible for their action. Now, in the Marxist theory, Marx have used economic determinism to understand the development of history, because when we are understanding how the concept of determinism has been used for understanding the society or has been used by Karl Marx, we find that he has used it to understand how the society develops and changes. And he found, and it was his scientific analysis, that historical changes and transformations takes place because of the changes in the economic structure of the society. He explained this in terms of the economic mode of production and the economic relations of production. In a particular historical age, a certain type of mode of production, it produces a certain relations of production, and that determines the nature of the superstructure, that is the state, and it also determines the nature of classes in the society. And with the changes in the mode of production, because of the rise in technology and because of the advancement of other means, we find that there occurs changes in the modes of production also, and it leads to changes in the relations of production, rising of new classes, but these classes are also marked by a type of subordination and dominance. There is no equality between class, or one of the class is haves and other is the haves not. And he said that it is the economic system that is the primarily, it is the determining factor. The others are dependent on the type of economic system which is prevalent at a particular point of time in history. And he has divided the society into two parts or two aspects of society. One is the base and second is the superstructure. The economic system constitutes the base, and the state, law, society, culture, everything constitutes the superstructure. And the superstructure is determined by what is the nature of the base. So, therefore, here he has used the principle of determinism in the economic sense and used it to understand the development of history, or he has used it to understand the various phases of historical development. He said that economic factors which form the base of the society, it determined the superstructure which comprised of state, law, government, art, culture and philosophy. And he has given a very important statement, and I would like to quote his words. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence. It is not the consciousness of men which determines their existence, but on the contrary, their social existence determines their consciousness. Now, this is a very important statement which highlights the key feature of the economic determinism of Karl Marx, the economic interpretation of history, or for that matter his theory of the dialectical materialism. Here in this statement, he is trying to emphasize upon the fact that it is not the consciousness which determines our existence. It is not the ideas which shapes how we live and what is our working condition, what is our living condition, but it is our social existence, how we live, and what is our socio-economic conditions at a particular point of time, that determines the type of ideas or consciousness that we will be having. And it is very important to understand that here Karl Marx is considering ideology or ideas to be not independent, but they are dependent on the economic structure of the society. Now, let us understand what is meant by the word dialectics. Now, dialectic is a method by which opposite ideas are examined and discussed to arrive at truth. It is also understood as a formal system of reasoning that uses the exchange of logical arguments to arrive at truth. Now, you see that there are two ways of understanding dialectics. One is that it is a method by which opposite ideas, they are examined and they are discussed, debated, finally to arrive at a certain truth. On the other hand, it also means a formal system of reasoning which uses the exchange of logical arguments, or it is based on arguments which are based on logic, which are based on reasoning, so that by mutual deliberation we can arrive at certain truth. So, basically the objective of dialectic or dialectical method is a process of arriving at truth. Now, Marx and Engels' the conception of dialectics owes much to the Hegelian notion of dialectics. He has used it in a much more detail, and the way he has used it has influenced Karl Marx and his theory to a large extent. Now, the metaphysical mode of thought views things in abstraction as though endowed with fixed property. Now, when you understand something at the metaphysical level, then we are understanding it in abstract form, having certain fixed properties. Whereas Hegelian dialectics considers things in their movements and changes, interrelations and interactions. So, it is analyzing the movement of things through various forms of interaction, interrelations, and it is in a continuous state of motion. It is not static with a fixed principle. Now, the dialectical method is based on the assumption that everything is in the continual process of becoming and ceasing to be. So, since there is continuous transformation going on, we know that something is taking birth, and after a considerable period of time that thing is dying out. So, the process of birth and dying out is a continuous process and is taking place under the dialectical method, in which nothing is permanent, but everything changes and eventually superseded. So, there are two aspects of dialectical method. One is that there is continuous transformation and change in the society. Everything is changing by the process of taking birth and then dying. And the second important feature of dialectical method is that the present is being superseded by something new, maybe something better. So, with this, the history and the society advances, it moves forward, it evolves. If you see the historical stages of development as understood by Karl Marx, then he has mentioned that how from a very primitive stage our society has developed and it has entered the capitalist stage because of the development of means of production, because of the rise of science and technology. Now, all things contain contradictory sides or aspects, whose tension or conflict is a driving force of change and eventually transforms or dissolves them. This has been conceptualized as thesis, antithesis and synthesis. So, basically it is trying to explain how the dialectical method works by underlining that everything has two sides. One is the positive side and other is its counter or the negative side or the opposite side. So, there is a conflict over anything in the society, and this conflict is essential because it is the driving force to change. It helps in bringing about transformation or dissolution, whatever you say. And these three processes has been termed as thesis, antithesis and synthesis. Antithesis is the opposite idea which develops in reaction in response to the prevalent idea, and after the conflict and the tension between the thesis and the antithesis, a new idea evolves or it is synthesized. Therefore, it is termed as the process of synthesis, and thereby the development takes place. Now, Marx and Engels understood change and development in the nature of material world. Hegel saw change and development as an expression of world spirit or idea. realizing itself in nature and in human society. So, Hegel applied the notion or the dialectical method to understand the movement of ideas in history, whereas Marx have used it to understand the changes in the material system or the material conditions of a society. So, therefore, this is a fundamental difference between Hegel and Karl Marx. Now, let us understand some of the post-Marxist criticism of the concept of determinism. Now, we have understood that what we mean by determinism. Now, let us understand what are the critiques of the economic determinism as been highlighted by Karl Marx. I have here included one of the important post-Marxist thinker whose name is Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci laid emphasis on the sociological and cultural aspects of class conflict rather than the economic focus of Marx's original writings. So, if you read the Marx original writings, if you read his theory, it is very clear that he has made an analysis of the society in terms of the economic system or in terms of economic factor. Whereas Gramsci had argued that merely studying the economic factor will not help in understanding why the revolution has not occurred in society or how the so-called capitalists are still maintaining their hegemony or dominance in the society. So, for that we have to understand the sociological and cultural factors also. In Gramsci, Marx's base and superstructure model is inverted. So, it has been rightly said that he has inverted the Marxian base and the superstructure model, where he is not identifying himself or accepting the Marxist position that the base determines the superstructure. In Marx, the economic structure which was based determined the superstructure, whereas Gramsci argued that instead of economics, it is ideology which controls the working class. And how that ideology is manufactured, how that ideology is inculcated amongst the workers, now that is another issue which Gramsci has dealt in details, that there are various means which are used by the state and the ruling class to propagate a certain ideology to acquire the consent of the people. In Gramsci or Gramsci hegemony means the ideological subordination of the working class by the bourgeois which enable it to rule by consent. Now, why ideological subordination? Because with the help of ideology you can control the mind and you can enable the rule by consent. Coercive structures may generate certain reaction and may be opposed by the people at certain point of time, but if the rule is by consent because of a sort of a conformity of the people to the ideology propagated by the ruling class, then the rule becomes very easy. So, in Gramsci's words, then culture and ideology is no longer a thing to be explained, but a thing that does the explaining. No longer an effect, it is becoming a cause. Very, very important, and it is totally inversion of the type of economic determinism which has been propounded by Karl Marx. Gramsci has given the notion of integral state because his model of state and civil society were different from the basic or base superstructure model of orthodox Marxism. Gramsci developed an expansive conception of the state, calling it the integral state. So, integral state is basically an expansive concept of the state, a broadened concept of the state, which included two components of political society and civil society. See, here he is making a very, very important distinction how a state rules, how a state maintains its hegemony. He says that there are two components of the state. One is the political society which is run through force, and another is the civil society, which is run or which is based on consent. Now, the importance of the civil society is very great for Gramsci, because here these societies are very much controlled by the state through the means of ideology. Now, the civil society for Gramsci was a set of institutions through which the society organized and represent itself autonomously from the state. It is an arena or a sphere which exists autonomously or independent from the state. It enabled maintenance of ruling class not through coercive mechanism, but through the manufacturing of consent, which is done through hegemony. So, why the importance of civil society? Because it is this civil society where the ideology plays its part, and this ideological manipulation is used to gain consent of the people, and it helps in the establishment of hegemony. Now, we come to the next important post-Marxist thinker, Nikos Poulentas. He was one of the leading Marxist theorists of the 20th century, and he interestingly talked about the merger of base and superstructure. So, instead of having the base and superstructure in the traditional Marxian sense, he argued that it is not possible or right to separate them, but they should be a merger. By this he meant that ideological, political and economic spheres are linked with each other and can be understood only with respect to each other. So, all these spheres, whether it is economic sphere, which is the so called base, or the ideological sphere or the political sphere, which constitutes so called the superstructure, they all are interrelated with each other and they influence each other, and they can be understood only with respect to each other. So, this is very important analysis made by Poulentas. Poulentas said that the political field of the state as well as the sphere of ideology has always been in different forms, been present in the constitution and also the reproduction of the relations of production. Now, you can see from his statement that how the state has been present in the constitution and reproduction of the relations of production, meaning that how political and economy they are interlinked with each other. So, it is not simply the economic structure which is influencing the state, but the state is also influencing the economic structure. That is what he emphasizes upon. Now, the state apparatus consists of three independent branches of economic, political and ideological sphere, which are characterized as the economic state apparatus, and then we have the repressive state apparatus and ideological state apparatus. So, three apparatus which is corresponding to the three spheres of society. Now, ideological sphere is central to the formation of economic sphere. So, you can see that it is in totally opposite or contrast to the Marxist theory. State depicts the class relations or class conflict in the society. It is not used by classes, for example, by bourgeois to exercise dominance. Now, we have some look at the post-Marxist critique of dialectics. Here, a very important name, Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault is known for his opposition to dialectics. He believed that the dialectic force events into a predetermined conceptual architecture, which reduces a hazardous reality to nothing more than a formula. Foucault's hostility to dialectics is inspired in large parts by his relationship or his understanding of the relationship between power and resistance. So, he said that by giving a fixed notion of dialectics, you are actually reducing a very complex reality to a very simple formula, that is thesis, antithesis and synthesis. And everything cannot be predetermined according to certain concepts, and also the reality is very complex in nature, which cannot be understood by certain simple formulas. And moreover, he argued that if we have to understand the processes of change in the society, we have to understand in terms of power. So, Foucault thought that the Marxist framework of class struggle was too narrow. He thought that it missed several crucial places where power relations happen. So, the Marxist theory, it could not help in understanding how the power relations operate in society. Foucault's criticism of the master-servant dialectics was indirect. He chose to confront instead the notion of truth and power associated with it. So, with this understanding of the post-Marxist criticism of determinism and dialectic, I come to the end of this lecture, followed by certain activity questions. What is post-Marxist approach? Name some important proponents. What do you mean by dialectics and the principle of determinism? Explain post-Marxist critique of determinism. So, with that, I come to the end of this lecture. Hope you have enjoyed it. Thank you very much.